All right, Rachel, my first few questions are going to focus on your experience on boards. That's the focus of this week's class, is nonprofit boards of directors. You're a member of several important boards in the DC region, including the United Way of the National Capital Area, the Ben's Chili Bowl Foundation. You're the incoming board chair of Leadership Greater Washington. You formerly chaired the board of Safe Shores, the Children's Advocacy Center, and the Washington Area Women's Foundation. What has motivated you to donate so much of your time and talent to serving on nonprofit boards over the years?
Oh, Charlie, it's so nice to be here this afternoon. Thank you for inviting me to join you and join this class. I'm grateful to have the opportunity to talk a little bit about the work that I'm able to do in the community in the District of Columbia. I'm a lawyer in Washington, D.C., and I used to work for a very large international law firm, Covington and Burling. I started my own firm with 3 of my partners 20 years ago. And part of the reason for starting our own firm was that we wanted to have a place where we could have some not only work-life balance, but also balance with the work that we felt that we were required and called to do in our community. And so we committed when we started our firm, which now employs about 85 people, that we would commit 10% of our hours to public service or pro bono work. And so from the very beginning of my legal career, I've been focused on doing public service work of one kind or another, but I wasn't able to really begin focusing on working hard in the community by sitting on not-for-profit boards until the last 10 years or so. My firm was up and running, things were settled, and I realized that I was looking for something else to provide some satisfaction. I have 2 children. They're now 24 and 21, and my husband is a teacher in the DC public schools. He's a reading instructor, and I recognized early on that he had extraordinary experience and love for the work that he was doing every day with students in our community. And I realized that I wanted to do a little bit of that kind of work too, not just working for my wonderful corporate clients like Pfizer and TD Bank and Borg Warner and things like that. That work was satisfying as well, but satisfying in a very different kind of way. And a dear friend of mine was sat at the time on the board of the Washington Area Women's Foundation, which is the only public foundation in the District of Columbia that focuses on issues related to women and girls. And she invited me to a couple of events. I was so impressed by the work that they were doing and really moved by it, that as she rolled off the board, I rolled on and took her board seat. And that was the beginning. I started that probably close to 12 years ago at this point. And since then, I've continued to do work with different boards, primarily local boards. I did sit on one national board, Equal Justice Works, which is a very important organization that focuses on helping law students as they graduate from law school get into public service work. And I realized that you could make much more impact, at least for me, if I focused on what was going on in the DMV or the District of Columbia specifically. And so impact was what I was really looking for. So my husband and I have turned our philanthropy, both time and treasure, into working in the District of Columbia, trying to lift all boats here.
Cool. That's a great story. So your motivation kind of goes back to the founding of your law firm, and you wanted to create a workplace where you have space for public service. And then a few years later, you answered the call at the Washington Area Women's Foundation. That's what got you started working on boards.
I think that's right. The other thing that I think was important, and I guess I think of this as both my professional children and my biological children. So with my professional children, we were trying to model good behavior as the founders of the firm. And with my actual biological children, having grown up in a household where my parents actually gave back a great deal to the community, both in time and treasure, I wanted to be able to model the same thing for my own children. It was important to my husband husband and to me that they recognize how privileged their life is and to take advantage of the opportunity to not only improve their lives, but improve the lives of their neighbors and people around them.
Cool. Cool. Thank you. So I'm wondering if you have any advice for someone who's considering a board of directors position, but like you said 12 years ago, you're new to nonprofit boards. How do you know whether a board is a good fit for you?
I think there are a couple of things you need to think about. These nonprofit boards are volunteer boards. And so I think it's really important to first feel as though the mission speaks to you. There are some people who mission speaks to them most when it's direct service. There are other people who mission speaks to them most when it's really moving the needle, where we're looking for real systemic change. Most organizations focus either on direct service or systemic change. Seldom do you have both of those things involved in one organization. And so I think you have to look into your own heart a little bit and see what's most important to you. And then the second thing I think that's really important is to make sure that there's a synergy between you and not only the staff of an organization, because you need to work and support the staff, but you and the other members of the board. The best boards I've ever sat on are boards where people really enjoy spending time with each other, and they are committed to each other, and they hold each other accountable for the work that they agree to do.
Cool. So it sounds like you spend some time vetting the organizations that you're invited to serve on their boards.
I do. Actually, I was on the Women's Foundation board for 10 years. I served as board chair for 3. And as I was rolling off, I termed out under the bylaws, and I wasn't able to sit on that board any longer. I fielded calls from other organizations who were interested in asking me to get involved in the work that they were doing. And I had a conversation with Nikki Gorin, actually was one person, and with my husband, and decided that I would take a year off of serving on boards and sort of step back just for a minute to think about what I wanted. I also, at that point, was at a point where I was starting to think about beginning to step back a little bit in my legal career. Not that I was going to fully retire, but begin to just step back just a little bit, let junior partners have the opportunity to take on some of the broader challenges, and make sure that we were moving into a process where the firm would continue long after I was gone, because that's always nice when you've started something, to make sure that it continues with a legacy after your time has been there. And so I spent that time thinking about that issue, about whether I wanted to work with direct service, whether I wanted to do systemic change. I found that I wanted to do a little bit of both, although I tend to work more with organizations that work on systemic change. There are organizations that I work with who do some on the ground work, but for the most part, I work with organizations who are looking broadly to really make change in the District of Columbia through changing the law, through changing the way things are handled, that sort of thing.
Okay, cool. So even though you're very intentional about which organizations you serve with, I'm sure that there's been a lot of challenges over the years, because all nonprofits face lots of challenges. And as a board member, you're responsible for helping lead them through those challenges. What are some of the most challenging situations you've experienced as a member of a nonprofit board?
The most challenging situations are when finances are really tight. I think in 2008, 2009, that was a very challenging time when we hit a recession. And at the same time, you had many national foundations decide that they were going to pivot away from the way that they had been funding not-for-profits. At the time, they had been doing a lot of pass-through funding to local not-for-profits who they partnered with to do work on the ground. And many of those national organizations, the Kellogg Foundation, the Ford Foundation, ones whose names are very familiar with people, decided that they wanted to do that work themselves. And so they pulled back from very significant funding for organizations. And so we were in the middle of a significant recession. As a result, individual funders pulled back their funding because they did not have the discretionary income that they had had previously. And then you had institutional funders who were pulling back from the foundation perspective because they wanted to do their work differently. And corporate funders, other types of institutional funders, did not have the same funds that they could use in the community. And so that was a hard and scary time. And we had to think hard about how we could build a sustainable business model for the Women's Foundation was the one I was most involved in then. And what was the best way to do that? I think that frankly, we're in that same type of time period right now. I think that 2020 is not going to be the hard year for not-for-profits. I think it's going to be 2021. I think that budgets were largely set in 2020 as we all found ourselves staying at home and found ourselves in a situation where there was real uncertainty about funds and budgets. Most institutional funders, at least for 2020, pledged to their organizations that they were going to stand behind their 2019 levels of giving, but they didn't say the same thing about 2021. There was so much uncertainty about 2021. And so I think we're in a shakeout period for not-for-profits, which from my perspective, frankly, is not such a terrible thing. There does come a time where there's overlap by a lot of small organizations who are doing very similar work. A lot of funds are going to run the back offices of organizations that are all doing the same work, and maybe there'll be some consolidation in the marketplace and lead to strong organizations providing broader service and doing more sustainable work as a result. I think we'll have to wait 18 months or 2 years before we can see that really, Charlie, but I do think we're in one of those very difficult periods right now.
So this is sort of a follow-up question because that was a really interesting idea that you introduced, that, you know, consolidation in some parts of the nonprofit sector might not be such a bad thing if there's overlap in mission. As a member of a board, have you ever been in a situation where you would advise the leadership to devolve the organization or try to merge with another organization?
Yes, actually, I have, and I believe that there's a certain point at which there are some organizations that do extraordinarily good work, but they don't necessarily need to be standalone organizations. I've been in that situation, especially as the organization is going through a transition from a founder to a new leadership model, and they're struggling to maybe make the value proposition clear to their donors. Founders can make that value proposition clear in a different kind of way often. New leadership often struggles with that, sometimes struggles with the sustainability of the business model, trying to figure out how to bring earned income into the organization as opposed to simply relying on people writing checks who are moved by your mission. And in many ways, even though the work they're doing is extraordinarily good, there's really no need to be a standalone organization. But if they could find ways to bolt on to other organizations that whose missions align, and where they can provide similar skills, but they don't have to be a separate 501c3 with all of the overhead and all of the difficult back office work that goes with that. Then more funds actually go into the community as a whole. Sometimes these issues are raised because of ego. To be perfectly honest, people like to be the executive directors of an organization. It's sometimes harder to step back and become the leader of what I would consider a subsidiary of a larger not-for-profit, but for the community as a whole, and actually for the organization, it often is a better outcome. You're not in a situation where you're constantly worried about whether or not you're going to sustain yourself from year to year, and instead you can focus more on mission.
Cool. Well, thanks for sharing that. I think it's probably a different perspective and kind of a new way of thinking for a lot of people. So thank you. I got one more question.
And just a quick follow-up on that. I mean, I think that's the kind of value that board members can bring to not-for-profit organizations, especially when you have board members who come from real business backgrounds, who are able to approach the work of these not-for-profit organizations as if they were businesses. They are businesses. They're just businesses with a little bit of a different focus. And sustainability is an imperative. And if you can't work your way through with a sustainable business model, and you're always scrabbling in order to make your budget year to year, it's important, I think, to step back and rethink whether or not the business structure you're operating within is the appropriate one.
Yeah, certainly. And so, I mean, you are a business leader and you're also a board member with a lot of organizations. So I imagine you're frequently solicited for gifts from nonprofits. How do you manage the demand for your generosity, and how do you choose which organizations to provide your financial support?
It's a very hard question, and it's a very hard thing to do. Because over the years, I've met lots of people. I've met a lot of people who run fabulous organizations. Part of what has helped, frankly, a lot in the process is I have a donor-advised fund that my family and I set up several years ago, quite a number of years ago. And we set aside funds every year. And together, my husband and my children and I talk about what organizations we'd like to support, what kind of work we'd like to support, and we give funds out as a result, and that has worked well for our family. I think different things work well for different families, but having the opportunity to set up something like a donor advised fund where frankly we're able to capture additional value and not pay taxes on that value, but instead use those funds to for charitable giving is a valuable way to make sure that we're able to support organizations, especially in our backyard.
That's such a cool idea, having a donor advised fund with your family and making philanthropic decisions with your family members. I think I'm going to.
It's actually as your children grow, and mine are near adults at this point. It's a great way to connect with them and to really think about what's important to them as well as what's important to me. I mean, some of our giving is more transactional. I ask a friend to give to an organization I'm involved in. They ask me to give to theirs. And so I think of that as a little bit transactional, but most of it is really based on firm commitments of the work that our family is really working through.
Cool. Well, those are all the questions I have for you about boards and your experience on boards. I'd like to spend the next 10 minutes or so ask you some questions about leadership and your career, so we can get some more advice for our students who are attending and will be watching this recording. So talking about nonprofit leadership, you are someone who's evaluated and supported many nonprofit leaders through your board service. So what are some of the traits that you think a successful nonprofit leader needs to have?
That's a very hard question. I think I think that commitment to mission is very important, and in a very authentic way. Authenticity is imperative as you're looking to donors to support the work that you're doing, but also as you're thinking through the strategic approach to the work that's being done. And so I would say commitment to mission and authenticity would be at the very top. I also think, frankly, being a good manager and being able to recognize that not only is it important for you to be running the organization, but for you to be bringing people up behind you, giving them the opportunity to do the work, to work very closely with your team, and make sure that you're not trying to do everything yourself, because frankly, it won't work that way. In more traditional business situations, we recognize that things don't operate that way. Not-for-profit organizations tend to be a little bit more on a shoestring, not always, but a little bit more. But that doesn't mean that you shouldn't also take the advantage and the opportunity of training people who are junior to you, giving them the opportunity to maybe do 110% of what they otherwise think they could do, so they stretch a little bit and show their stuff. You can really get the support of your teammates as a result.
Cool. Thanks for that advice. And I know a lot of our students who are thinking about careers in working in nonprofits encourage you to, try to work at a place where you're given opportunities, like Rachel was talking about, to stretch yourself and show what you're capable of. Because like you mentioned, nonprofits do provide good leadership and growth opportunities for everybody, because so many of the staff members are expected to do multiple jobs and accomplish so much. So
I think that's exactly right. The one thing that I have noticed on the different boards on which I sit is that there's real unevenness in the way in which boards approach the evaluation process of the executive director. I mean, it's obligation of the board to oversee the work of the executive director, and the executive director then oversees the other employees. And that's a very important part of the responsibility of a board, is to work closely with your executive director, leadership development of the executive director, and real evaluation in real time is very meaningful. And I know some boards step back and do less of that because they're so moved by the commitment to mission of the executive director. But it's very important for people to be able to give that type of helpful and constructive criticism. Especially if they have a little bit of an objective perspective, they can step back a little bit and really help make critical and crucial adjustments in the way in which a not-for-profit business is being run. That is a real value add that board members can bring to a not-for-profit organization that is not always taken advantage of.
Yeah, providing good feedback. I also just want to note that I really love how you emphasize that nonprofits are businesses.
They absolutely are. I mean, in the District of Columbia, I mean, I forget what the percentage is, but there's a very significant percentage of people in the District of Columbia who work for not-for-profits, and their businesses. They just have a somewhat slightly different business model. But I sit on the United Way board. That's a beast of an organization with a very large budget. It's clearly a business.
Yeah, and last I checked, it's 26%.
Thank you.
People in the district work at nonprofits.
I knew it was a very significant percentage. It would be crazy for us to think of it as not a business, but being operated as something. It's a disservice to all the people who work in those organizations to consider them not businesses and to think it's something other.
I completely agree. So I want to talk a little bit about your career and how you've gotten to where you are today. So you're the founding partner. So you were at a law firm before, and you're the founding partner of a major law firm in DC now. You've been there for about 20 years. You've been recognized for your leadership by Washington Business Journal, as well as several law organizations. What have been some of the experiences that you've had and key decisions that you've made that have helped shape your career to be where you are today?
I think Probably the most important decision was the decision to start my own law firm. I had an 11-month-old and a 2-year-old at the time, and when I began talking about it with my partners, I told them I thought they were a little crazy, and we ultimately decided it was the right thing to do, in order to get a little bit more control over our own lives, and to really continue the commitment to public service that had been so important to us. I had gone to the first law firm I worked at, because they had that commitment of 10% of their hours, to public service. It was a very important, piece of the work for me. And so that's probably the most crucial step. The other important step is that I have the support of my family. My husband and I talk a lot, especially when our kids were smaller, about the responsibilities we're able to take on and what was too much and what was what had to give. And we were very clear and honest with each other about that, because it wouldn't help if it provided pressure on our home life. And my partners and my law firm have been very supportive of me being more actively involved in the community and being really an outward-facing member of our firm. It's good for our firm brand, frankly, to be honest, and it's also a valuable way to give potential opportunities to our younger lawyers who find that they can do some public service work with other people in the community, and get to know some other folks, and also stretch their legal chops a little bit.
Cool. It sounds like some of the decisions that you look back on as being most significant were around work-life balance and prioritizing public service.
I think that's right.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
So my last question before we open it up to all of our other guests, and I see some of you have put questions in the chat already, which is great. We should have another lively discussion once I cede the floor. But my last question is, a lot of people think that you need to choose between making a big impact or having a successful career. How have you managed to be so active in your service to nonprofit organizations while also leading a major law firm? I know you talked about the 10%, I guess, rule that you have at your firm, but is there anything else that you could share about how you've managed to do both?
I think for me, Charlie, I was able to do it because I began working in the community as I was at an older point, a later point in my career, where after things were largely set, where I had a lot of support in my professional organization. And so I didn't have to spend quite as many hours working day in and day out on the work. I had others who did that for me. And so that made it easier for me. And I also found that from the not-for-profit community's perspective, they were looking for a little bit of gray hair when they were looking for advice and counsel, when they brought people in who they thought would help support the work that they were doing and expand their impact in the community. So at least for me, I found that waiting until I was in the latter half of my career made that an easier process. Earlier in my career, I would do one-off type of public service work. I did a lot of work with the Democratic National Committee. I did a lot of work with neighborhood legal services. Many of the things I did were more legal in focus, and they tended to be more short-term.
Okay, cool. Thank you. Thank you for answering all my questions and all my follow-up questions, and for joining us today.